welcome. In today's video, which is the first of a three-part installment, I'll be making my Harvey Girl uniform. If you're unfamiliar with the Harvey Girls, they were the waitresses at the Fred Harvey chain of restaurants, which is a chain of restaurants in the American West that opened in the late 1870s, early 1880s, and continued in operation all the way until the 1960s. The goal of the Fred Harvey chain of restaurants, which were often situated next to railway stations, most notably the Santa Fe Railway, was to give newcomers to the American West a sense of home and comfort. The requirements for being a Harvey Girl were that you had to be between the ages of 18 and 30, unmarried, attractive, good-mannered, of good moral character, intelligent, as well as have at least an 8th grade education. If you were hired on by the Harvey chain, you went to a couple months of training, and then you were sent out to your post. The Harvey Girls and their story and legacy were immortalized in the 1946 MGM musical starring Judy Garland, entitled The Harvey Girls. There's also multiple books. I'll link a couple below. The Harvey Girls had such a wide era of operation. I chose to make my uniform from 1898 was the era I was going for. This video will be about making the blouse or the shirtwaist. The next video will be about making the skirt, and the final video will be about making the iconic apron. Hope you enjoy this video and stay tuned for the future videos in this series. These are the books I used for reference in making my shirtwaist. In the lower right-hand corner is my pattern, the truly Victorian 1894 shirtwaist. But the large leg of mutton sleeves were all wrong for my intended period of 1898. Therefore, I used a Dover reprint of Harper's Bazar, a popular period fashion magazine, to see what sleeves from this year looked like. Below that is Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion 2, which I referenced for a general sleeve shape of the late 1890s. Then I finally used Prior Tires, the Victorian Dressmaker, to draft the sleeves for my shirtwaist. The sleeves are a two-piece tailored sleeve with moderate fullness for a slight puff at the shoulders. There is also a 2-inch placket on the inside seam to help get the sleeves on easily, yet also maintain a snug fit on the forearm. Then all my pieces were cut out of my chosen fabric, a black-on-black pinstriped wool suiting from the Aiea fabric mart. The first step in the construction process was to attach the right side of the placket to the wrong side of the front pieces using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The placket was then folded over to the right side of the blouse and top stitched down. The next seam to be sewn was the shoulder seam, which was pinned, sewed, ironed open, and the raw edges serged to finish. Now it was time to tackle the collar. I chose to interface the collar with a period stiffening known as Tarlatan, which can now be found in most print supply shops as it has had an alternative use as a cleaner for printing plates. The way you see me pinning the layers together is wrong. The interfacing should be on the outside, so when the collar gets turned right side out, it would be on the inside and therefore hidden. I did the exact opposite, but I soon resolved it. After the two collar pieces were sewn, the corners were clipped and the collars turned right side out. I also decided to top stitch the collar for added visual interest, as well as to match the top stitching on the placket. Now the collar attaches to the blouse through the use of a collar stand. The collar was sandwiched in between the inside and the outside collar stands, pinned and sewn. The corners, as well as the curved seam, was then clipped and the whole thing turned right side out and pressed. The outside collar stand was then pinned and sewn to the blouse, right sides together. The neckline seam allowance was then pressed upwards away from the blouse, and the inside collar stand was then folded over the seam to finish, pinned, and whip stitched down by hand. Now it was time to sew the side seams, which were pinned, sewn using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and the raw edges were serged to finish. The next step was to construct the peplum of the shirtwaist, which helps the shirtwaist stay tucked in. The back and front pieces of the peplum were pinned, sewed, ironed open, then finished using a serger. I then marked the hem and the front facing with tailor's chalk. Iron that fabric to that line, then sewed it by machine. Since this blouse would be tucked in, no one would really see it. I then moved on to the waistband, which I interfaced the outer waistband with a lightweight sew-in interfacing for a small amount of body. I then marked the seam allowance of the inner waistband with tailor's chalk, then pressed it towards the top of the waistband. The peplum was then pinned onto the outer waistband matching notches and gathered to fit, leaving a ½ inch on either side for seam allowance. The inner waistband was then pinned on top, sandwiching the peplum in between the two waistbands. The peplum was then sewn and turned right side out and pressed. The outer waistband was then pinned to the blouse, matching notches, and gathered to fit. The waist seam was The seam allowance of the inner waistband was then folded over the seam to finish it, and was sewn by hand using whip stitches. Now it was time to tackle the sleeves. The upper and lower sleeve pieces were pinned, sewed, and finished with a serger. Then I marked the seam allowance with a placket, as well as the 1-inch hem of the sleeve using tailor's chalk, which were then folded and ironed. I then attached the sleeve to the shirtwaist, matching notches, and gathered the excess to fit, moving it towards the top of the sleeve head/shoulder seam. The seam was then sewed using again a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finished with a serger. Here is a close-up of the sleeves and the shirtwaist in general on my dress form Joan. There's some weird pulling because it's on the dress form and not me. Now it was time for the buttonholes, which I marked following the pattern instructions using tailor's chalk and sewed using the buttonhole foot on my machine. I used a seam ripper and tiny scissors to open the buttonholes up. I then folded the right side of the blouse over the left side and marked the button placement. My buttons are Dill Button brand, which I got from the Aiea fabric mart. I sewed them on using black upholstery thread. Now instead of having a button and buttonhole closure on the collar stand, I chose to use a size 2 hook and eye because I felt the area was too bulky for buttons to look good. step in the construction process was to sew on 2 snaps, one on each side, to close the sleeve pocket, which are historically appropriate because they were invented in 1885. And they're special to me because they come from my grandmother.
Spend my busman's holiday on the Atchison Topeka and the Saddle Bay. All aboard!